Jody and I chose America as our honeymoon destination. Initially, I preferred the West Indies, but Jody preferred the USA, so we went with her choice. Surprisingly, I didn't mind one bit. We hopped on a British Airways flight from Heathrow and touched down at JFK several hours later. Despite our failed attempt to join the Mile High Club during the flight, it didn't dampen our spirits. We quickly made up for it as we embarked on our tour of the East Coast, exploring New England and its surroundings. Hailing from Huntington in Cambridgeshire, near the esteemed Cambridge University, we were particularly thrilled to visit Yale and Harvard. It felt like a dream come true for us small-town folks to be in such prestigious academic settings. The biggest surprise was how amazing and countryside-like New York State turned out to be, totally different from what we had imagined. Over 3 weeks, Jody and I ended up staying in more motels than your average American does in a lifetime, getting cozy with each other every chance we got. We enjoyed every single moment of it, promising on the plane ride back home that we'd go on another adventure soon. It was a great plan, but as usual, life and work got in the way. Fast forward 9 years, and there we were, Jody and Dave Martin, in our early 30s, happily married with no kids, but with a hefty mortgage on our lovely house, just like most people in our situation at that time. Despite that, we were living life to the fullest. I had recently been promoted to junior director at Alskins Limited, a company specializing in cutting-edge incinerator plants, where we were leading the industry in our niche. Though it was a small company, it was growing, and I had grown with it. Under the guidance of my boss George, who practically ran the show, I was probably 4th or 5th in line. Jody had done well for herself too, working as a school teacher, but her career progression depended more on seniority than skill, which sometimes left her feeling frustrated that I had advanced faster. I later wondered if this jealousy had anything to do with her actions. Despite any bumps in the road, I can say for sure that we were still deeply in love, maybe not with the same fiery passion as when we first got married, but that's normal. Our love life was decent, with occasional dry spells when we were busy, balanced out by periods of intense activity when the mood struck. Our story begins in the midst of one of those dry spells, but we were eagerly anticipating a much-needed period of intimacy. We hadn't taken a vacation in nearly a year, but with Jody's school break starting the week prior, we were gearing up for a well-deserved trip to the beaches of Spain the very next day. Jody convinced me to go shopping for new vacation clothes, but as usual, I only ended up with a single pair of shorts. Predictably, Jody left the store with 4 or 5 new outfits, each one showing more skin than the last. It was the last outfit she picked out that really caught my attention. Jody always got more daring and adventurous on vacation, doing things she wouldn't normally do at home. That day, she seemed to be fully embracing the holiday vibe, and the blouse she chose definitely reflected that. "Do you like it?" she asked, holding it up for my opinion. "It's a bit see-through," I commented, not really disapproving. "Then it's perfect," she replied with a grin. "I should probably try it on," she added, disappearing into the fitting room with the sheer black satin blouse, leaving me surrounded by a bunch of other guys waiting for their partners. I wondered if she'd come out to model it for me, like some women do, or if she'd decide on her own. I had a feeling she was wearing a pretty revealing bra that day, so if she did come out, it might be a little show for the guys waiting around. And sure enough, she did come out, right into the open area, no peeking around corners. I was wrong about one thing, though, the bra. It was probably the skimpy one she had on earlier, but since she took it off to try on the blouse, it didn't really matter. Male eyes, including mine, widened in surprise as Jody twirled around to show off the new blouse. Well, supposedly to me. It was black, it was delicate, and other than that, what could I say? It covered her up. Kind of. It did the job, I guess, but I couldn't exactly say it was protecting her modesty. What was the phrase I was looking for? Showing off her assets? Definitely not. Her upper part of a body were hardly concealed, barely preserving her modesty. We could definitely make out the shape of her chest, no doubt about it. My wife Jody was flaunting her assets for all the guys there, as if she were completely without clothes. The thin fabric of the blouse did little to hide anything, every detail plainly visible. It would have been less surprising if she had been completely without anything, and she seemed to be enjoying it. I couldn't exactly say I was upset about it, but she was certainly reveling in the attention, the cheeky thing. Jody decided to buy the blouse, and we moved on to the next store. That's where she found the new bikini, or what you could call a bikini. She disappeared into the fitting room and took her sweet time. Eventually, she pulled back the curtain and stood there for me to admire. My heart raced as I looked at her, but I could tell a couple of other guys waiting around were also getting an eyeful. Jody, you see, is quite the looker, about 5'3", reasonably slim. "Where's the top?" I managed to ask when I regained my voice. "We're going to Spain," Jody declared excitedly. "Who needs a bikini top there?" It was true. The year before, after just a couple of hours, she ditched her top and joined the many other women going without clothes on the beach. She never bothered with it again the whole time we were there. But a department store in Cambridge was hardly the same as a beach in Spain. "Do you like it then?" she demanded, arching her back slightly, highlighting just how stunning was her part of a body. "Love it!" A couple of the onlookers chimed in before I could even respond. Jody giggled at the attention, twisting around to offer a different view. "Can I have it then?" she asked me, as I stood there unsure whether I should be embarrassed or turned on by the whole spectacle. "I'll take it," one of the guys joked, and the others laughed. "All right, you can have it," I said. Giving in to her, I warned her before things spiraled out of control. As we drove home, I started to ponder. Jody wasn't usually like that, so something was definitely off. My wife Jody was one of those strong-willed women, and when she felt slighted, she always wanted payback. For months leading up to this, she'd been flirting with a coworker right in front of me. It all culminated in her kissing him on the dance floor, while I had to stand there watching. I wasn't even sure where his hands were, come to think of it. Afterwards, we had a huge fight about how she embarrassed me in front of everyone, but all she had to say was that it was my fault. Apparently, I forgot our first date anniversary a few days prior, and she decided to teach me a lesson. When was the last time we even celebrated that, for crying out loud? Then, about a month later, I got home late when we were supposed to go out for dinner. It was only about half an hour, stuck in traffic coming home from a client meeting up north. Hours on the road, plus an accident on the motorway earlier in the day, had me delayed. I even called to say I'd be late, but it didn't seem to matter. By the time I got home, she'd already left and left a note saying she canceled our dinner reservation. I had no clue where she went, just that she expected me to pick her up later. A bit turned out to be over 3 hours, and it wasn't an invitation to join her, but more like a demand for me to come get her. I gave her a piece of my mind and told her she could find her own way home. If she went out on her own, she could come back on her own. "Plenty of guys here would be happy to give me a ride home, Dave. I just don't know how I'd repay their kindness," were her exact words. When I got to the club, I was furious, and finding Jody surrounded by a bunch of young guys, most of them 5 years younger than her, didn't help. They were clearly hoping for something special to happen that night. The skimpy dress she wore did nothing to convince them they made a good choice or to calm me down. As I approached the group, at least 3 of them had their hands on her, around her waist, on her exposed shoulder, and one dangerously close to her. "Excuse me, fellas," I said as I carefully made my way through to her, gently pushing their hands away from her. "Time for this lady to head home." "Get lost, buddy," one of them shot back, trying to push me away. "We saw her first. Go find your own girl." "It's okay, guys," Jody intervened. "My husband's here to take me home. Sorry to break up the party, but I gotta go with him." They weren't happy. It was clear they thought Jody had been leading them on, and now I was there to ruin their fun. 2 of them, including the feisty one, started to push me. It had been years since I'd been in a fight, not since my school days, but I'm not one to back down easily, so I pushed back. Things were getting tense until Jody interrupted again. "Hey, cut it out, guys," she scolded them. "Leave him alone, okay?" Her words quieted them down a bit, but the atmosphere was still tense. "Come on, fellas," Jody continued, as if she was enjoying the drama. "I'll give you all a goodbye kiss, then me and my hubby are out of here." That might have calmed them down a bit, but it just made me furious. "You kiss one of them, Jody," I shouted at her, "and don't bother coming home tonight." A standoff ensued. People around us started to move away, and the bartender began clearing glasses. Most of the young guys seemed willing to back off, but the 2 troublemakers were just as agitated as I was. Trouble was brewing, and I found myself right in the middle of it. Suddenly, 2 big bouncers showed up and started to separate us. I can't say I wasn't relieved, even though I was all hyped up and ready to fight. "You guys stay put," one of the bouncers told the group of young men, pushing them back, then turned to me. "I suggest you get out of here, buddy, while you're still in one piece," he said, pointing to Jody. "Take that troublemaker with you." There are times when you stand up for your wife when she's insulted, and times when it's better to walk away. I chose the second option and pulled Jody out with me. Plus, I kinda agreed with him at that moment. The ride home was quiet, but once we got home, we had another big argument. We barely spoke to each other for the next few days, and I warned her that if she ever pulled something like that again, there would be serious consequences. Now, about what happened in the changing rooms and why. "It was just a warning shot," she told me. "I'm not happy you're working tomorrow morning when we're supposed to be going away, so it was just a heads up." Well, in my opinion, there's a big difference between flashing your boobs at strangers and actually leading them on like she did before. The next day, I only had one appointment with Butch. He was one of those super real guys from America checking out our products. My boss, George, had visited them a couple of weeks ago, and Butch was here to see how we do things. My job was to quickly run him through our manufacturing process, then take him to see one of our plants in action. I planned to have a quick lunch with him, then head home, change, and drive to Stansted Airport for our late afternoon flight. Jody was really angry when I told her about my meeting with Butch. She demanded I cancel it and find someone else to cover for me. I tried to explain how crucial the meeting was for our company and how it could open up big opportunities in the American market for us and for me personally, but she wasn't having it, and that's probably why she acted out the day before. "You care more about your stupid job than you do about me," she yelled when I refused to cancel. I didn't bother bringing up all the times we had to change plans because of her commitments at school. I knew things would be fine once we were on the plane. I knew Jody could be a bit self-centered and stubborn sometimes, but I knew that when I married her, so I couldn't really complain. I gave her a pat on the backside as I left, kissed her on the cheek, and reminded her to be ready and packed when I got back home in a few hours. "You better not be a minute late, or you'll regret it," she snapped at me with more venom than I thought was necessary. The meeting went really well, actually, better than I expected. I hit it off with Butch, even though we had only briefly met before. He asked some tough questions, but I handled them well, and by the end of the morning, it seemed like we would be getting the order we wanted. Around 11:30, Butch asked where we were going for lunch. I suggested a local pub, but he had a different idea. "Let's go to Mario's," he said. "We can talk more there. I still have a few things I need to go over with you." I checked the time, saw I had a little time to spare, and agreed. An hour later, we were only halfway through our meal, and he was bombarding me with questions that caught me off guard. How much did he want to know about our company, our product, and even about me? I decided to quickly call my wife to let her know I might be running late. I explained to him as I excused myself to the restroom, not wanting him to overhear any frustration. I figured I'd give it another 10 minutes or so before I'd reluctantly interrupt him and explain why I needed to leave. "You're what?" Jody yelled over the phone when I told her, not willing to hear my attempts to reassure her that we still had time. "I warned you, Dave. If you were late, you'd regret it. I'm not missing this holiday, even if I have to go alone." I tried to calm her down, but it was no use. By the time I hung up, we were both upset, and she wasn't listening to me anymore. I decided to go back to Butch and explain my situation, asking if he could make his own way back to our plant. That would save me some time, and I'd only be a few minutes later than planned getting home. Butch greeted me when I returned to the table. "Well, Dave, it's time I came clean with you," he said. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. What was this about? How did he know I was in a rush? I sat down, bracing myself for whatever news he had for me, worried he was going to cancel the big order I thought we had secured. How did he know I was in such a hurry? I messed up by trying to rush things. Why didn't I just tell him from the start that I had a tight schedule? "I want you to work for me, Dave," he said confidently. "How about moving to the States?" My jaw dropped when I heard that. "Can you repeat that?" I asked once I recovered. "All these questions, Dave, I've been checking you out," Butch continued. "George didn't mention it, but we're planning to manufacture your plants in the U.S., and we need your expertise to set it up." "But," I stammered, but Butch kept going. "George suggested you as the best fit. He doesn't want to lose you, but this deal could be a game changer, and he believes you're the man for the job." George knows? I asked, surprised. Of course, Dave, but I wanted to meet you first to make sure. I collapsed back in my chair, overwhelmed with excitement. Working as an executive in America? Jody would be ecstatic when I told her, but I never imagined it would happen like this. I listened in shock as he outlined the incredible package: a salary beyond belief, share options, a company BMW, even an apartment until we found our own. You've got a plane to catch, he said, wrapping up. You can give me your decision after your holiday once you've talked it over with your wife. I'll give it to you now, I blurted out. I agreed, and I'm sure my wife will too. We both stood up, shook hands, and Butch sent me off to pick up my wife and catch my flight. I walked away feeling ecstatic, but also checking the time to make sure I still had a chance. It would be close, but while heading to the parking lot, I called home. It rang, but no one answered. Checking the time, I realized I was 2 minutes late from when I said I'd be back. By then, I reached my car and dialed Jody's mobile. She answered right away. "Where are you?" she yelled. "On my way home, honey," I said, excited to share the news. "You're an a-hole, Dave," she cut in. "You care more about your job than me." She told me she had to call Terry for a ride to the airport since she knew I wouldn't be on time. Terry? Yeah, Terry Jones, her art teacher colleague. I wasn't too fond of him, especially since he was the one she kissed when we fought last time. "Jody," I pleaded, "I'm almost home, just a few minutes late." "Too late, Dave," she snapped. "I'm halfway to the airport. If you're not here, I'm leaving without you." She hung up, and despite my attempts to call back, there was no answer. I glanced at the time and thought about how ridiculous this situation was. I still had plenty of time to reach the airport and check in, so I turned my car around and headed towards Stansted, arriving there just as I had expected, with at least half an hour to spare. I parked, grabbed my parking ticket, and made my way to the departure terminal, hoping that Jody had at least taken my suitcase with her. I looked around, searched, but couldn't find her, and time was running short. Eventually, I approached the departure desk and inquired if my wife had already checked in. "Oh yes, here it is," the pretty blonde attendant said after checking her list. "She checked in about 15 minutes ago as Mrs. Martin, and there's also a Mr. Jones." "What?" My initial reaction startled the poor girl, and I had to apologize for my outburst. "There must be some mistake," I insisted. "Mrs. Martin, yes, but not Mr. Jones." The attendant could see I was quite upset and double-checked everything for me. "No, that's correct," she finally confirmed. "The tickets were booked under the name of Mr. and Mrs. Martin, but Mrs. Martin changed one of them to Mr. Jones." "Can she do that?" I muttered, unable to believe what I had heard. "Yes," the attendant replied, starting to sympathize with me. Realizing that something unusual was happening, she paid the 40-pound fee for the change, and I was left standing there feeling lost, like some kind of refugee, not sure what to say or do. The attendant explained that Mr. Martin had his passport, which seemed to make everything legit. I thanked her and walked away from the desk, feeling utterly unhappy. What was happening? What was she planning? This was going way beyond a joke. Glancing at the departure board, I realized the plane hadn't departed yet, and they hadn't even started boarding. I hurried to reach the boarding gate, but I couldn't get through without a boarding pass. No ticket, no entry. It was clear. I tried to argue and plead, but when security was threatened, I gave up, went to the bar, and sat there, feeling defeated. I couldn't believe it. My whole world had been turned upside down in just half an hour. Jody couldn't be doing this. No way she could be going to Spain with that guy Terry Jones instead of me. It couldn't be true. I wish someone would tell me it was all just a bad dream. Then an idea hit me. Not the best idea, but it seemed like one at the time. I rushed to the observation lounge on the other side of the airport, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening. It used to be an open terrace, but now, with the security measures, we had to watch the planes through large glass windows. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw her. There was my wife, Jody, walking across the tarmac toward the waiting Boeing 737. She was hard to miss with her flowing blonde hair and slim figure. Then that a-hole Jones stepped off the courtesy bus behind her and followed her to the plane. When he caught up to her, I lost it. Even from a distance, I could see him put his arm around her waist and her kissing him on the cheek. I know I shouldn't have banged on the glass window and yelled, but I couldn't help it. The security guards had to do their job, so they detained me. They let me go eventually when they realized I wasn't a threat. I headed back to my car feeling defeated. Trying to call Jody on her phone was pointless. What a mess. What a disaster. I think I cried that night, but I was so drunk when I stumbled home from the pub that I can't be sure of anything. I couldn't call her in Spain because I didn't have her number and her cell phone wouldn't work abroad. The next day around noon, I suddenly woke up to the sound of the phone ringing next to me. I found myself asleep on the couch, holding the phone tightly. I'm not sure why. I answered the phone, confused and unsure of who it might be. "Is this John?" I heard my wife's voice, clear and authoritative like the school teacher she is. "Yes," I replied simply. "So you're not going to apologize, you a-hole?" Jody accused me. She asked if I didn't feel bad for disappointing her again. I was taken aback, asking if she really thought I had let her down, but she continued to accuse me of prioritizing my work over her feelings. I futilely brought up the time she missed dinner with our new neighbors because of a school issue. "That's different, Dave, and you know it," she yelled. From my perspective, it wasn't different at all. Realizing our argument was getting us nowhere, I tried to shift the direction of our conversation. I had just woken up and was still groggy, barely remembering the events of last night, but I tried to tell Jody about the job offer from Butch. "Jody," I said more calmly, "I need to tell you something about my job. I got an offer." "There you go again," Jody cut in. "Your job, your damn job. That's all you care about. What about me, alone here in Spain?" That's when I remembered everything, and I felt my love for Jody start to fade. "Alone, Jody?" I asked. "What about Terry Jones?" She was silent, shocked that I knew he was there with her. "What about him?" she finally said, more quietly. "Are you still in bed with him?" I pressed. After a pause, she defiantly said, "What if I am? You brought this on yourself, you a-hole. Did he do a good job?" I asked, trying to hurt her. "Better than you, Dave," Jody snapped back viciously. "So deal with it." Then she hung up, likely slamming the phone down. If my marriage wasn't over before, that last exchange might have been the final straw. The next morning, not too early, I was in George's office talking about the new job. He seemed surprised I wasn't in Spain, but I dodged giving him a straight answer. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked him. He replied that he couldn't until he had met me in person and determined if I was the right fit. I sarcastically thanked him, noting that this might have cost me my marriage. I shared my troubles with him, but he wasn't particularly shocked. He remarked that husbands often find out last. When I asked what he meant, he vaguely mentioned that, at the last few company events, my wife Jody had been, for lack of a better term, very sociable. I demanded clarification, but he simply shrugged, leading me to draw my own conclusions. I couldn't help but wonder who this woman I had loved and married for so many years really was. George tried to lighten the mood by mentioning his Lynn, but I was too preoccupied with my own issues to show much interest. "Who's Lynn?" I asked absently. "My Lynn. She's what every man dreams of," he said. Confused, I asked him to explain. He told me she's his new personal assistant, whom he met in Asia. I just looked at him, lost in thought. He called himself lucky and insisted I would understand once I met her. Every gain seems to come with a loss. The following days were a blur, partly due to the issues in my marriage and also because of how quickly my job transfer was happening. Both my future employer and the licensing authorities were eager to finalize everything, making me feel overwhelmed. Then Jody called again, as I expected she would, around mid-morning. She expressed her love and bragged about how great her time was going. I attempted to share some news with Jody, but she cut me off, demanding an apology for my supposed attitude. I tried to ignore her taunts and tell her my news, but she interrupted again, claiming she still loved me but was waiting for an apology. In the meantime, she mentioned she had someone else to please. I ended up hanging up the phone, unsure if she had hung up first. Jody sounded like she had been drinking, not completely wasted, but enough that a sensible conversation was impossible. If she prioritized her affair with the art teacher over our potential future together, I concluded that was her issue, not mine. The week turned out to be the most extraordinary one of my life, filled with both incredible excitement and deep sadness. What would be the outcome? Jody's next call caught me off guard, coming in the early morning. She sounded confused and asked, "Dave, how did you know Terry was with me?" I explained that I saw them boarding the plane together, trying to clear my groggy mind. Surprised by her call at such an odd hour, I confirmed my presence at the airport, my frustration growing. I questioned how else I would have known about Terry being with her. Jody wondered why I hadn't intervened. I raised my voice, explaining that by the time I arrived, they had already checked in, and security wouldn't let me past without a ticket, leading to my arrest. Jody claimed she thought I wasn't coming, and that Terry had just given her a ride to the airport, deciding to join her impulsively. I sarcastically noted Terry's convenient readiness to travel. I hung up on her before she could say more. She tried calling several more times, but I was either too preoccupied with my plans or chose not to pick up. A few days later, I finally answered. "Hi, is that you, Dave?" Jody asked. "Yes, it's me," I responded, asking what she wanted. "You, Dave. I want you," she said. "Terry turned out to be a real a-hole, and I need you," Jody said. I responded with something unclear. She told me she returned to her room last night to find Terry with another woman, to which I dryly remarked how terrible that must have been for her. She didn't catch the sarcasm and wondered aloud how anyone could do such a thing. I barely kept from laughing, as I agreed it was hard to believe. She drunkenly lamented how Terry had betrayed her, and I offered a half-hearted expression of sympathy. Jody announced she was coming back early because she couldn't bear to stay there any longer. She mentioned her return flight to Heathrow was at 4 p.m. the next day and asked if I could pick her up. Initially hesitant, I then realized I could indeed meet her. I assured her I'd be there at 4. She then asked if I had been trying to tell her something about my job during our last call. I downplayed it, saying it wasn't anything she needed to worry about, knowing she'd eventually find out on her own. I was ready and waiting by 2:30, slightly annoyed when her flight arrived 20 minutes late. Standing at the arrivals gate, I put on my best smile as she walked through. As soon as she saw me, she excitedly greeted me, dropped her suitcase, and gave me a passionate kiss. I must admit, she looked incredible. Jody's tan complemented her blonde hair perfectly. "Let's go home, sweetie," Jody whispered, expressing how much she missed me and her eagerness to reconcile intimately. It seemed like she had forgotten all about needing an apology from me and was ready to love me again. I suggested we first grab a coffee or tea. Despite her insistence to head straight home, I convinced her to stop at a nearby cafe. Over coffee for her and tea for me, I asked how her vacation was. She admitted it started well, but quickly turned sour. When I jokingly asked if Terry wasn't as satisfying as she'd hoped, she looked at me with sadness, shedding a tear, and revealed she caught him with someone else in her bed. I didn't mention that technically, the bed and room were ours, considering I had paid for the holiday. Jody expressed her disbelief at Terry's betrayal during their supposed vacation together. I offered my sympathy, understanding her feelings. Dismissing Terry, she insisted on going home to make amends with me. When I tried to share my news, she interrupted, eager to focus on us. Jody cut me off, suggesting we talk on our way home. But I had already decided what to do. I handed her the car keys, explaining that I had arrived in her old car since my company vehicle had been returned the previous day. I also gave her the house keys, clarifying they were now solely hers. I informed her that I had transferred everything into her name and settled all bills for the month. I mentioned she might find enough from selling the house for another short stay in Spain, noting the car needed some attention with a nearly bald tire and a gearbox issue. Jody seemed confused, not fully grasping my words. I continued, revealing that I had accepted an incredible job opportunity in America with great pay and benefits, everything I had hoped for. Jody's face lit up with a smile as she processed the news, which made me feel a bit sad. She eagerly asked when we would be moving. I informed her that my flight was leaving in 40 minutes. Her excitement showed when she asked if I had a ticket for her, too. I said no. She then asked when she would join me, and I had to tell her she wouldn't be coming with me. I apologized, but she didn't. 10 minutes later, I walked into the departure lounge alone, leaving Jody behind, in tears at the counter where security wouldn't let her through. The last image I had of her was her tear-streaked face as she watched me leave her life. Strangely, it felt like a familiar scenario had flipped entirely. Just 10 days earlier, I had been the one stopped at the desk, unable to follow my loved one. It was a different airport and destination, but the heartache felt just as intense. Fast forward 9 years, 3 months, and 6 days. I found myself back at Heathrow, in the very same terminal I had left from years ago. It wasn't my first time back, but this time I had been in the UK for 2 weeks and planned to stay much longer. My work with Butch's company in Huntington, USA, turned out to be a huge success. I climbed the corporate ladder to become CEO of that division and owned a significant share of the company. Butch had become a close friend over the years. In an interesting turn of events, it was through him that George offered me the opportunity to return to the UK and take up the position of managing director at Alskins. He was stepping down, and the company had significantly expanded since my departure, largely thanks to our partnership in America, which opened up a bigger market for their products. This move was beneficial for everyone, particularly for me, as I was set to gain a significant portion of the company too. I stood in the arrivals section, waiting for a former colleague from Butch's company who had been a great support from the start. Although they no longer worked there, it was exciting that they would be joining me in the UK. I didn't need to see her to know she had arrived. The reaction of nearly every man in the crowd, straightening up as they noticed her, gave it away. Mylan was as stunning as the first time I met her, if not more so, and her smile brightened the entire terminal as she saw me. Whispering to her two companions, she pointed me out, and they hurried over. "Daddy, Daddy, I've missed you so much!" Maddie, our 5-year-old daughter, shouted excitedly as she jumped into my arms. She looked just like her mom, and had already made a few young boys sad when she moved to the UK with us. "Hi, Dad," said my 8-year-old son, not as energetically, but his smile showed his happiness. He was tall for his age, and I was eager to see him adapt from American football to soccer here in Europe. Perhaps he might even play for Arsenal one day. "First day of the rest of our lives," my wonderful wife said as she kissed me.